Hey, this is the process that I went through in ordering and setting up my new Dust Gorilla dust collection system. I had a really great experience working with Oneida to design the perfect dust collection system for my workshop and for my machinery. We had several discussions about my machines, the measurements of my workshop, and the features that I wanted in a dust collector and ductwork here in my shop. The people at Oneida recommended the perfect system just catered for me. But after finalizing all the measurements, I was actually a bit nervous that the ductwork wouldn't fit. But the Oneida engineers are a lot smarter than I am, so it worked out amazingly well. Not long after we worked together on the design, the boxes were shipped from New York to Virginia, and as you can see, it's a bit tricky for large delivery trucks to get into my driveway out on this country road. But this driver was amazingly good at backing in. And I was amazed to see how many boxes arrived in the shipment. Oneida was kind enough to send me some additional products to try out in my woodworking school, so I had towers of boxes in my shop. Fortunately, I was able to give them away to a friend who was moving. Everything was packed really well by Oneida, so nothing was damaged. With the help of the Oneida engineers, this was the spot that I decided to install my new Dust Gorilla, with the plan to run the ductwork up the south wall, along the ceiling, and down the north wall, next to my Felder planer and jointer. But this setup would require me to remove most of my lumber storage, so I had to remove the shelving from the wall here. But I had converted my chicken coop several years ago into woodshed, so it's not a big deal for me to lose space for lumber. It's actually kind of nice not having so much in here in my shop. Before I removed the lumber rack from the wall, I had run a 30 amp outlet from the electrical panel. And while I was at it, I ran another 20 amp outlet so I can run my air conditioner at the same time as my table saw. Yes. I originally made a mistake when I was hanging sheetrock in my workshop and didn't run enough outlets over here, so now I can actually use my table saw with air conditioning and not get drenched with sweat in the summertime. I was impressed by how thorough and simple the user manual was, which is really important for a non-technical guy like me. The shipment came with a handy template for leveling and hanging the wall brackets for the Dust Gorilla. After marking where the lag bolts would enter the wall stud, I used a cordless drill to bore pilot holes. Then we used a cordless impact driver to drive the lag bolts most of the way into the studs. And once the bracket was hanging on the lag bolts, we tightened them all the way. After fully assembling the wall bracket, we added a foam gasket to the cone. The gaskets keep dust from escaping into the air. I lifted the cone and barrel onto the wall brackets, and then we added bolts to fasten them together. We added another gasket to the top of the barrel for the next step, and then we tightened down the bolts between the cone and barrel. Then we added a foam gasket to the fan housing. We attached the fan housing to the barrel and fastened it down with more bolts. The motor assembly was very, very heavy, so I actually wouldn't recommend this method for most people, but I did carry it up a ladder and set it on top of the fan housing. I believe some other people rig up a pulley system to use their car to lift the motor assembly up there, but that sounded very time-consuming to me, so I decided to try the brute force method. It worked for me, and I'm lucky I didn't get hurt, but don't push your luck. I aligned the motor assembly on the fan housing and attached the two parts using more bolts. I added some gasket to the filter plate and then attached the filter Plenum elbow. Then two of my boys helped me attach the two parts with more bolts and nuts. Once they were tightened together, I lifted the elbow up against the fan housing. Then I bolted the elbow to the fan housing. Whenever possible, I like to let my kids help on projects like this so they can feel a sense of accomplishment when building or assembling something. Before fully tightening the nuts and bolts, we lifted the Plenum support brace in place and tightened the top part of the brace in the top bolts. And the lower part we secured with a dedicated bolt that screws into the wall mount bracket. Next, we put the drop-in silencer into the HEPA cartridge filter. Then we assembled these clips. Make sure they look just like this. We'll come back to these clips here in a minute. But first, we set the stacking sound filter on top of the HEPA cartridge filter. Then we use these clips to attach the two parts, spacing them evenly around the circumference. Then we added another gasket on top of the stacking sound filter. To make things easier, I placed a cardboard box under where I'd be lifting the filter in place, and I added the J-bolts and thumb nuts to the filter plate. I set the assembled filter on top of the box and lowered the J-bolts until they hooked onto the stacking sound filter. As you can see here, this part is a bit tricky, and it took a few attempts to get all 4 J-bolts in place without one falling off. Once all 4 J-bolts were in place, I tightened down the thumb nuts. Then I added more of the J-bolts and thumb nuts to the fine dust bin, lifted it onto the bottom of the HEPA cartridge filter, and tightened the thumb nuts down. Next, I removed one of the top thumb nuts and added this braided ground wire to ground the filter. I attached the clip onto the wire frame of the filter. This helps prevent a static electricity fire around all the fine dust. Then my son attached the cone to the drum using a flexible hose and clamp bands. Hey, it's starting to look like a dust collector. We added another ground wire by screwing it into the metal lid and running the other end to the bottom end of the cone. Next, I opened up the starter panel and secured it to the wall with some screws. I then put the cover back on. Next, I removed the drum's lid clamp so I could install the cool dust sentry that I mentioned earlier. This is the sensor that sets off a flashing light when the drum is getting full of sawdust. The dust sentry just gets dropped into this hole, and the nut is tightened on the underside of the lid with a couple rubber washers. Then I attached the flashing light to a place where I'd be able to see it while using my machines. And the dust sentry got plugged into a normal wall outlet. You can see it's flashing while empty, so I actually had to adjust it once it was almost filled with sawdust for the first time. Because I push all my machines backward on mobile bases when my classes are in session, I didn't want any ductwork hanging down from the ceiling in the middle of the shop. So I just ran a main line across the ceiling, connecting the ductwork from metal straps. And I worked with Oneida to design what I'll call stacks on either side of the shop. During installation, I decided to make a couple modifications to the ductwork, and Oneida was really cool about quickly shipping me some new ducting. Oneida's duct pipes are really high quality and offer a lot of flexibility, like with these flex joints. On all the joints, I connected the ducting with sheet metal screws and sealed them with special tape and sometimes silicone caulk. From each stack, I just ran flex hose from the blast gates to each machine. Each stack has a floor sweep where I can sweep wood shavings and sawdust that gets on the floor during classes or during my own personal projects. And here's what it looks like after finishing all the ductwork and after using it for a couple of months. Well, thanks for watching this video on setting up a Oneida dust collection system. If you wanted to see more about the dust collection system, I released a previous video that you can go check out, and I'll leave a link for it here in the video. So thanks for watching, and I hope to see you here next time in my shop.
If you're interested in woodworking with a mix of hand tools and power tools, visit my website at woodandshop.com, where you can find a bunch of free woodworking lessons, workshop tours of amazing woodworkers, and our very popular tool buying guides. Make sure you subscribe to my free newsletter and check out my 10 steps for getting started in woodworking. Enjoy!